Positioned like an amphitheater, this residence dominated the town, the harbor, and some pretty country houses in a fertile valley on the other side of the harbor. It was most agreeable, most practical, and the safest house for His Majesty. The Grand Marshal continued occupying the common house. General Drouot lodged near the Emperor in a building complex used until then by the garrison officers. Those buildings served to house the officers, the kitchens, and the domestics of the palace at the same time. In town, as at the palace, cisterns replaced fountains. They were large and sufficient for all needs. Until the Imperial Guard arrived, the Elban National Guard was on duty to serve the needs of His Majesty, who had nothing but praise for its precision and devotion. A few armed sailors from the frigate Undaunted, commanded by a non-commissioned officer, were made available to the Emperor by Captain Usher. They were on duty at the palace alongside the National Guard. The garrison barely sufficed to guard the fortifications and the city's outer gates. The National Guard was already sharing that duty with it. Captain Usher, informed at the time of the landing that the Emperor's table lacked many things not yet available on the island, most graciously and promptly sent part of the personal provisions he had on board without allowing any reimbursement. During the crossing and after the landing of the guard, the British were astonished by the Emperor's familiarity with the soldiers. This formed an amusing contrast with the aristocratic haughtiness they were accustomed to. When His Majesty left the frigate, he had a Napoleon given to each sailor and gave Captain Usher a small box decorated with his portrait surrounded by diamonds. On May 23rd, the frigate Dryade, commanded by Monsieur de Montcabrier, sailed into the roadstead, bringing with it the brig Inconstant, and at daybreak the following day, 5 or 6 British transport were reported carrying the Imperial Guard. Monsieur de Montcabrier went ashore, saw the Emperor, the Governor, and General de Lasme, and made all plans for the loading of the garrison. The guard had been traveling for 25 days. This delay had worried the Emperor, who feared they might have been prevented from boarding. He went down to the harbor with the Grand Marshal and was greeted there with cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" The next day, these soldiers relieved the garrison and thereafter began as a rule to take their off-duty walks so as to reconnoiter the road traveled by His Majesty. Finding them everywhere, the Emperor wanted to know the reason. He was told the agreement they had made amongst themselves. He could not control the emotion brought on by such attachment. "Tell them I have found children. They have nothing to fear on my behalf." These old soldiers were good and were loved by the islanders. Children were always about them and drilled with sticks and paper hats. Lithography has captured such a scene and faithfully rendered it. On June 4th, the Dryade and the transports left Porto Ferrajo. Napoleon had gone aboard that frigate a few days after her arrival. The Neapolitan frigate Laetitia, which had brought Princess Pauline to Porto Ferrajo on June 1st, departed on the 2nd, promising the Emperor to return in a few months. His Majesty had accompanied it to the harbor. The frigate sailed away and soon was out of sight. Part 2. Marchand's beginnings in the service of the Emperor, from the stay in Elba to the 100 Days, June 1814 to June 1815. Chapter 3. As soon as the guard arrived, the Emperor's arrangements took on a certain amount of stability. This is a good time to describe living arrangements of the island's new sovereign, his court, his household, and details concerning him personally. The officials of the church and the courts, the civic and community governments, and the civil servants saw no change in personnel. General Drouot was governor of Porto Ferrajo and the whole island. General Cambron commanded the guard. General Drouot ate each day with the Emperor. General Cambron had regular contact with His Majesty, as did the port captain Philidor. The gendarmerie, Captain Paoli, his lieutenant Bernardi, and Tayada, captain of the brig Inconstant. The Grand Marshal continued to head the emperor's household. It consisted of 4 chamberlains, Messieurs Ventini, Lapi, Trentini, and Gualandi, 6 ADCs, aide-de-camps, Monsieur Ventini, Jr., Benetti, Bernardi, Pons, and Paris, the 6th not having been named. The emperor remembered them in his last moments, as well as Vicar General Arrighi. He had always spoken of them and their services with gratitude. Finally, 2 palace quartermasters, Monsieur Deschamps and Bayon, the treasurer, Monsieur Pérouse, the secretary, Monsieur Ratturi, a doctor, Dr. Ferraud, a student of Corvisart, and a pharmacist, Monsieur Gatta. The staffs for the bedroom, dining room, and stables were also organized. While passing through Fontainebleau, Gervais and I learned that Constant, the emperor's first valet, had not followed him, and that Rustam had not returned from Paris. Gervais, who was Constant's uncle, felt the shame of his nephew's misconduct. He ran to the latter's nearby country house and found him prostrated by his own ingratitude. He tried to convince him to come with us, relying on the emperor's great kindness towards him. But Constant knew the emperor better than his uncle. He felt his failing was due to a lack of courage, and that it would not be forgiven by his master. He remained home, torn by shame and sorrow. If these 2 servants failed in their duty and gratitude, such was not the case with Monsieur Hubert and Pilar, who accompanied the emperor to Elba and only returned to France after my arrival. The former was going back to the bedside of his dying wife. Such men do honor to faithfulness. Remaining with me were the valets, Gilly and Novras, and the wardrobe boy, Denis. Saint-Denis, delayed in Mens, arrived only after the surrender of that city. He brought several of the emperor's snuff boxes that he brought back at a sale of His Majesty's personal effects. At Fontainebleau, the emperor, knowing that Constant and Rustam were not coming, inquired as to Ali's whereabouts. That was the name that had been given to Saint-Denis when he donned the Mameluke costume. When told that Ali was detained in Mainz, he said, "I'm sorry, that one would have followed me." In the outer chamber were Monsieur d'Orville, usher, Gervais, in charge of the linen room and furniture storage, Santini, keeper of the portfolio, 2 Elban ushers, Matthias and Archambault, heading the footmen, the latter became the head groom in St. Helena, and Gaudron and Leon, polishers. The food department included Monsieur Collin, food comptroller, who soon returned to France, his aide, Queval, who replaced him, Totin and Cipriani, butlers, the later followed by Emperor to St. Helena, Pierron, pantry head, and he became a butler in St. Helena after the death of Cipriani, Ferdinand the chef, and 2 helpers, Chandelier and Lafosse. The stables had some 50 horses. Chauvin was in charge, Amadou the chief groom. There were also 18 or 20 stable boys, French or Elban. Vincent was the head of the tack room. I was called on to perform an interior duty I was not familiar with, having up to that time been chamber usher. After Monsieur Hubert's departure, His Majesty called me in and asked me several questions. I tried to answer as best I could. His kindness in talking to me prompted me to tell him that in 1812 he had exempted me from the draft. He said, "You are mistaken. I had no right to do so." I told him that had been his reply to Countess Montesquieu, who was asking this favor for me, but that he had paid for a military replacement out of his personal purse. I believe I remember that, and I am pleased that it was you. I told him that at Rambouillet, my mother had told me of the Empress's resistance to her entourage's advice that she leave Paris, and her desire to show herself to the people with her son. She said she did not doubt that as a daughter of one of the Confederate sovereigns, she would be respected by the Allied troops, not believing that the Austrian emperor, her father, could remove her husband from the throne and deprive his son of a crown that was to be his. The King of Rome, I told him, grabbed onto each piece of furniture so as not to go to Rambouillet, which he deemed too ugly, made impatient by the force used on him, and force had to be used to get him into his carriage. He said in anger, "I don't want to leave Paris. Papa is not here. I am the master here." The emperor asked me for what amount I had been listed out of the 2 million he had distributed at Fontainebleau. I told him I was the only one on Elba who was not included. "You won't be short-changed. I'll take care of you. I will marry you off. I am naming you my first valet. I entrust you with my private purse. It contains 800,000 francs in gold. Pérouse will give you 3,000 francs a month for my clothing and pocket money. You shall submit to me an account of this each month, and I will settle it." There was in the Elba Palace a ceremonial like that at the Tuileries, but on a reduced scale. One was admitted to this small court upon presentation by the Grand Marshal or one of the chamberlains. Certain people were admitted. Each Sunday, Mass was heard in one of the rooms in the emperor's apartment, that before the drawing room. It was celebrated by Vicar General Arrighi. The emperor was always present, and the civilian and military officials were invited. The emperor would see them after Mass. The town bells were often heard. He used to say that their sound reminded him of his youth, when Madame Mère took him to Mass, and also of the time he had spent in Brienne. That was his school. One habit I had occasion to notice was that whenever he wished to deny some accusation leveled against him on a serious matter, he would cross his forehead with his thumb and say, "I am aware of no such thing." As Madame and Princess each had a chaplain, they heard Mass at home. Every Sunday there was a family dinner where some townspeople were invited. Every evening there was a salon gathering held by Madame or the Princess. All persons who had admittance to the palace could attend. At the stroke of 10, the emperor would retire to his quarters. The salon generally ended at midnight. After the princess arrived, there was a theater in Portofrajo. These details may appear of little interest. However, it was in his private life that the emperor had to be seen. It is there that I learned of his kindness and the easygoing nature of his service. For me, his grandeur and glory are everywhere. I have said that the emperor had me handle his private purse, and that he would go over the accounts each month. In Paris, the emperor rarely had any money on him. In Elba, he always had a purse containing 300 or 400 francs in gold. His alms were numerous, and all his outings were marked by acts of kindness. One day, when he was riding his horse, he was accosted by an old woman from Marciana. She greeted the emperor and told him, with the familiar and respectful honesty of the Elbans, that she was poor and had lost her son. She had less regret since he had died in his service, but she was in need and was appealing to him. His Majesty said, "I'll take care of you. Have hope." "At my age, sire, we have no more." "Well, have faith in me." "Oh, I won't be lacking in that. Faith came to me when I saw you." The emperor pulled out his purse and gave her 5 Napoleons. The poor woman, seeing so much gold, was still busy thanking him when he was far away before she noticed. She feared he had made a mistake, and that evening went to the Grand Marshal and asked if the emperor realized it was 5 Napoleons he had given her. When he heard of this considerate thought, the emperor was touched and told me that evening to put her name on the list of pensioners. The Grand Marshal had assured her that the emperor had not made a mistake, and indeed meant to give her that sum. Among the pensioners was Grand Vicar Arrighi, a kind and excellent cleric known for his virtues, insight, and advanced age. He was not rich, and the income derived from his job was not sufficient to relieve the misery he saw around him in so many forms. The emperor told me to put him down for 3,000 francs from his own purse. Every month I would carry 150 francs to this worthy prelate. He would smile when he saw me and show me all kinds of courtesies which touched me. He would invite me to sit down and would relate some historical stories of the emperor's youth. He said the latter came from a great family of Florence, which revolutions forced into exile and which came to settle in Corsica. He added that a Bonaventure Bonaparte had been beatified and had been a saintly man. He told me that after the death of the emperor's father, as Madame was a very young widow, Archdeacon Lucien had assumed management of the household property. He was a highly respected man and had foreseen the young Napoleon's rise, just as Paoli did. I had heard the emperor say that the former hid his gold in his bed, and that before dying he had said to Joseph, "You're the eldest, but there is no head of the family," pointing to Napoleon. Paoli said of him that he was patterned after Plutarch's men and would make a great mark on his country. His Majesty said he used to have a great affection for Paoli, which waned when the latter sided with the British, necessitating his family's departure from Corsica. The emperor said that when young, he had been very boisterous, quick, dominating. All surrounded him. When he acquired a taste for studies, which came early, reading became for him a passion he never relinquished. He had fond memories of Father Petrau, his mathematics professor, and would say, "That man understood me." I have many similar anecdotes that do as much honor to the generosity and sensitivity of the emperor as to the character of the good Albans. From time to time, His Majesty would tell me on his return about his distribution of his gifts, but more often had I the details from Saint-Denis or Novares, who accompanied the emperor during his rides on horseback or by carriage, and were witnesses to them. I must here deny all the absurd tales that have been told about Napoleon's temper, his harshness, the epileptic seizures he allegedly had that made him unmanageable, and declare the falsity of the rather widespread rumor that he wore armor under his uniform. I can attest to never having seen anything other than a flannel shirt. Serving the emperor was an agreeable task. He was good, easygoing, and gentle with all who surrounded him. If it happened that he had become cross while outside, and this ire was felt indoors, it was never violent. It was thus easy to approach without increasing its level. There was always good reason for his anger, which he expressed with great diplomacy. Whenever his bad temper was mentioned, those who had reason to feel guilty about causing it, and whom, out of caution, he had only mildly scolded, would recognize his moderation and their mistake, and would not do it again. The emperor was just and always ready to forgive. The first day of my service with the emperor, he asked me for some tea. I sent the wardrobe boy to get some in the pantry, and he brought me a tray carrying all that is needed for tea. I took this from him and out to the emperor, who was walking on a garden terrace close to the sea. He poured himself a cup, put sugar in it, and was about to drink it when he said to me, "Where does this cup come from?" "From the pantry, sire," I replied. He threw the container and its contents against the wall, breaking the cup. "Henceforth, use only those things in my kit and no others." I apologized for my ignorance of the kit, as nothing had been told me about it. That first lesson was harsh. I was taken aback. I was not immune to the fear inspired by the emperor, but I was sure of the devotion that had led me to offer him my services, and I remained calm after this moment of temper. I went to get from his kit the gilt tray and all that was related to tea, and came back to offer these to him. His face had changed, and he said, "That's fine." That was the only outburst I experienced with the emperor. These lasted but a moment. That instant gone, he only seemed to remember them in order to give some indication of his satisfaction with your service or person. This was calculated, and was for him a means of testing a man and assessing his character. When he returned that evening, he greeted me with a kindness that dismissed any fear I had of displeasing him, which had worried me for that part of the day. I did not see him. He questioned me about my studies, my family, my social habits. Only a short time was needed to convince me of the falsity of the palace rumors about his difficult temper. I have never understood the purpose it served those close to him to believe such rumors. Never did the emperor commit acts of violence against any of his servants. He was far removed from such actions, and criticized them in others. He was not in the habit of saying he was satisfied. He even seemed to pay little attention to efforts made to please him, or greeted them with indifference. But this was only pretense. It often happened by the same system that if he had recompensed you, he would show during the day some signs of impatience. as if to say not to attach too much importance to the favor he had done you. If after scolding someone and noticing that he seemed hurt, he would approach the person he had chagrined and either pinch his ear hard or tug at it, this implied all was forgiven. These ups and downs of humor were rare, as we always found the emperor in a bright and cheerful mood at home. When he had gotten attached to a man or was sure of him, of his affection and devotion, that man became invulnerable. He was under his protection. Only serious faults could threaten the friendship with which he protected him. His character leaned towards indulgence. It was easygoing, and he made large allowances for human foibles. Speaking one day of the abandonment he encountered at Fontainebleau, he said that among men there were good ones and bad ones, that one shouldn't generalize and put them in the same basket, and that he had seen some people worth much more than the act they had just committed. Our task was therefore not so much to anticipate his desires, but to search out what must please him. There was no shortage of these attentions and that care in St. Helena, where he was so miserable. Each of us has a clear conscience about having softened the bitterness of the few days he had left during this harsh captivity. It can look to this memory of devotion to ease the pain caused by his loss upon that awful rock. The emperor was consistent in the dress he had adopted, a three-cornered hat, the uniform of the Guards Mounted Chasseurs, that of the Grenadiers was for Sundays in Paris, riding boots or silk stockings with buckled shoes. During the first months of his stay on Elba, he wanted to wear white breeches buttoned at the bottom with cuffed boots. Finding this accoutrement uncomfortable, he reverted to white cloth trousers and buckled shoes. When his boots were removed on his return, he wanted to don his shoes right away without changing socks, which could be done without inconvenience, as his boots were clean inside, and he had a fresh change of clothes every day. The emperor had acquired that habit in Paris, where often, returning from a ride or from hunting, he would attend a council of state or one of the ministers and did not take time to change clothes. He was always clean all over. His hands were elegant. He tended to his nails carefully. He had fine teeth, and they remained so until his death. The emperor slept little. I had my first opportunity to observe this. He rose several times during the night. He was so well organized he could sleep when he wanted. 6 hours sleep was enough. Taken all together or in several naps, he was always happy when he awoke. "Open the windows that I may breathe God's good air," were often his first words. He sometimes went out at night into the garden in his robe. The nights were clear and he enjoyed their pure smell. The calm was interrupted only by the sound of waves breaking 200 feet below the terrace where he walked, and by the sentinels, "Who goes there?" or by the emperor, should he start to sing, which he sometimes did while thinking of someone else. He was rarely in tune and would repeat the same words for 15 minutes. It would be, "Had the king given me Paris, his large city," he would change its ending and substitute, "For I prefer my beloved, give me back Paris," and also, "Yes, it's done, I'm getting married," or even, "Here's daylight, Colette is not coming," or finally, "Marat, the people's avenger." As I stated, his thoughts were on something entirely other than what he was singing. His voice was loud, and his laughter carried a long distance. When he sang in this way, he didn't care who heard him. He seemed to be urging the night to end and waiting impatiently for the daylight. As soon as it dawned, he dressed, got on his horse, followed by Novares or Saint-Denis, headed for the harbor, picking up General Drouot on the way, and rode to the Grand Marshal's or the Pontiol, or waited his guard exercise. When it began getting warm, he would come home and lunch, sometimes alone or with Generals Drouot and Bertrand. He preferred the simplest dishes, lentils, white beans, green beans, which he loved, but was afraid to eat for fear of finding threads, which he said felt like hair, the very thought of which would turn his stomach. He was fond of potatoes prepared any way at all, even boiled or grilled over embers. He commonly used chambertin, which he cut with a lot of water. He never or rarely drank fine wines or liqueurs. A cup of black coffee after lunch assured his sobriety. Back in his quarters, he would slip on a robe, go into his study, and wait for his bath, which generally lasted 1 to 2 hours. In Elba, it was a saltwater bath, which suited him well. There he read or dictated at times, but seldom. In that residence, I saw the sovereign's correspondence with the emperor bound in a red leather volume. One day, when I remained alone with the emperor while he was in his bath, he asked me if I knew how to tell how much water his body would displace. I had to admit my ignorance. Give me some paper and a pencil, I'll tell you. He calculated it, and I have forgotten the number. The students of the Polytechnic School were always happy to solve the questions I asked of them when I went to see them. The emperor said he had always taken an interest in the Polytechnic School. It had been founded by Monge, whom he liked. Laplace, Lagrange, and Prony, who were his friends, were its heads. Mathematical sciences, which he loved, were taught there. The origin of the rumor that I didn't like that school is for the young students, mostly 15 or 16, were sowing their wild oats amid the corruption of the capital. So I placed them in barracks, which displeased them. The emperor had a habit of remaining in his bath an hour and a half or sometimes 2 hours. He would always get out with hot sheets, go to bed for an hour, shave, dress, and around 4 or 5 p.m., climb in his carriage and go pay a visit to Countess Bertrand, whom he sometimes took along with him. He would head for some point on the coast and return in the boat that was waiting for him there, manned by the guard sailors, with Gentilini, an island sailor, as pilot. That boat generally had provisions of oranges and candles for use at night. When the emperor, once dressed, emerged from his apartment, the first valet would hand him his hat. He would take it on one hand, and in the other a handkerchief sprinkled with cologne, which he would touch to his lips, forehead, and temples. He was then handed a snuff box, a spyglass, a candy box containing licorice. The emperor never left his room without placing these objects in the various pockets of his uniform. If during the day he attended the Council of State, the chamberlain on duty would not fail to carry these same items, so as to give them to him if he had forgotten one, either in his study or in the drawing room. The emperor loved luxury and magnificence, but at the same time wanted to see economy practiced within his household. He would say about someone who had violated his trust, "I am prepared to give away 100,000 francs, but I will not tolerate having 1 cent stolen from me."